Americans today face moral and economic challenges unknown to previous generations. As a result, Christians across America have joined in prayer for national revival. But the question remains, is revival really the answer to our nation's problems? Join historian David Barton as he traces America's history back to the source in Building on the American Heritage. Uncover the forgotten stories, examine the nation's founding documents, and discover firsthand our founding fathers' original intent. Explore the morals and values America was built on centuries ago. Learn the truth of America's past so you can shape America's future. This is Building on the American Heritage.
David, revival is something that pastors talk about. We as Christians all say we want it. What exactly is it? How do you know when you're in one? And what should we be praying for?
Well, I'll tell you, that is a big focus in America right now is revival. I have never seen the type of prayer I'm seeing now. We have the National Day of Prayer. We've had that for decades. Days of prayer go back hundreds of years. But in the past several National Days of Prayer, there have been over 50,000 prayer groups on each National Day of Prayer.
Not 50,000 people. You're talking about 50,000 different groups. So a lot of people.
In civic arenas. I mean, they're meeting at courthouses, they're meeting at police stations, at fire stations, they're meeting at school. 50,000 groups praying, and a big emphasis has been praying for revival.
Yeah.
We're praying for revival. What's it look like?
Yeah.
And the best answer to that is, well, let's go back and look at some previous ones and see what's common to them. The first thing that's common to all revivals, and you have several biblical revivals, you have several American historical revivals. You have the First Great Awakening, the Second and Third Great Awakening kind of run into each other. You have the turn of the century revivals. You got all these revivals in American history. What's characteristic is they always last for decades.
It's not, now I thought revival was something that happened very quickly. You had a move of the Spirit, the nation was in revival, and that's it.
People think if God answers our prayers for revival, He's going to swoop in and fix every problem in the nation.
Well,
no.
I grew up going to weekend revivals. Is this not what you're talking about?
No such thing. Yeah, I mean, not in a historical sense. That's not a revival. The First Great Awakening went from 1730 to 1770. That's 40 years. The Second Great Awakening and bumps up against the Third Great Awakening, but that goes from 1801 to 1878. That's 77 years.
Wow.
You could have been born in 1802. You could have lived a full 75-year happy life, died in 1877, and never knew you were in a revival because your whole life was spent
so your
in
whole
revival.
life was part of that revival.
Yeah, so let's go back to the First Great Awakening, because historians agree without that there is no United States of America. It took that revival to lay the political landscape, to lay the spiritual landscape that allowed America to become an independent nation, create a form of government, create a Bill of Rights, etc.
So help me get this in the timeline then. So the First Great Awakening is before the Revolution.
1730 to 1770 is the Great Awakening, First Great Awakening. 1776 is the Declaration of Independence. 1787, Constitution is written. 1789, the Bill of Rights is written, and that's where we start.
This revival you're talking about, this is where all the seeds were planted.
This is where for 40 years, all this thinking was changed, and then it manifested itself politically in the next several years after that. Because all this stuff that's been talked about over here, it's like, wow, now we've got a chance to do this in policy. We've never been able to do this before. We've always been under the British monarch. We can do it ourselves. Whole different approach.
So if there was such a good result, meaning our nation being born and all the great things that happened with our document, how did we get the revival itself then? That's what people want now. We want to have a revival like that.
Well, you go back to someone like George Whitefield. There's a lot of preachers in the First Great Awakening. Gilbert and William Tennant were big preachers. Jonathan Edwards, that famous sermon on sinners in the hand of angry God. You got Samuel Davies, you got Samuel Cooper, you got Jonathan Mayhew, you got all these famous preachers, but probably the best known is George Whitefield.
Yeah.
And by the way, here's some of Whitefield's original writings from the First Great Awakening. And here's some sermons from Mayhew, who was also part of the First Great Awakening. Here's Wesley's sermons, and all these different sermons. Here's Davies, a bunch of sermons by Samuel Davies. All these guys in the Great Awakening. What's significant is George Whitefield was 34 years of the 40 in the Great Awakening. He made 7 missionary journeys to America. He traveled from Maine to Georgia and back, preaching as he went. Now, in that 34-year period, he preached 18,000 sermons.
Wait. That's 1,000, almost 1,000 a year.
Quick math, that's 3 a day.
That's
That's not an easy thing to do.
No, I get worn out if I speak couple of times a day.
Right.
He does that every
He does that every
day
He
for a whole
averages
year.
3 sermons a day for 34 years.
And I'm guessing he's not doing this flying American Airlines.
Oh, no. No, he's on horseback. As a matter of fact, one of the neat things is he had a portable pulpit he carried with him. They still have that pulpit, but he would stick that pulpit on the back of his carriage, and he would go to the next place, unfold that pulpit, crawl up in it, preach a sermon, fold it up, head to the next place.
How do you physically do that
Whitfield
much?
did this on horseback 7 times. Maine, Georgia. What do you do when the weather's tough? What do you do when you come to a tornado or a hailstorm? This is not inspirational work he's doing here. This is hard
What
work.
level of commitment does that take on his part for him to be?
I'll tell you, revival killed him. He didn't think revival was all that fun. The last 2 years of his preaching, he would get up in that pulpit and preach. He'd get out of that pulpit, go over, spit up his guts and cough up a bunch of blood, get on his horse, ride to the next place, sit up that pulpit and go preach, get out of the pulpit, go over, cough up a bunch of blood. It was not easy work. But if he hadn't done that, we don't have a revival, we don't have a country.
Yeah.
So, and
It was his sacrifice, his investment. I
You
mean,
bet it
that was
was.
an investment of his life,
You
not
bet.
just his time, but his life.
And do you know how effective he was in that revival? 80% of everyone that lived in America heard him physically preach a sermon.
Wow.
No broadcast back then. That means you got to be on the spot. You know how many communities he had to go into for 80% of Americans to hear? Anybody that thinks it's this great spiritual inspiration, God's going to sweep in and fix all the stuff, look at Whitfield. This is the other fun thing about revivals, fun thing. Revivals are always characterized by lots of opposition, but not from the secular folks, from the spiritual folks.
So shouldn't we be, you'd think it'd be the spiritual folks saying, hey, isn't this guy great? We're so glad
It
you're
was
doing
the preachers that attacked him, said,
It was the
"Whoa."
opposite.
And see, revivals nearly always involve old wineskins, new wineskins. Jesus told that story, you don't pour new wine in old wineskin, it'll bust and you'll lose all of it. But they said, Whitfield, we've never done it this way before. No, we're used to doing it this way over here. And so Whitfield comes in with a whole new way, open air meetings, not just in one denomination. He was messing with all denominations. He had what was called his Father Abraham sermon, which brought people together rather than divided them. And they said, Whitfield is wicked. He's evil.
Because he's messing with their
He's
old
messing with their
wineskins.
tradition.
Yeah.
And that's always the characteristic of revival. Charles Finney comes along in the Second Great Awakening. Now, what do you mean an altar call? We don't do altar calls. We don't have open air brush arbor meetings. We do it inside of churches. Oh, he's out in the middle of the community doing stuff. And they said, whoa, Finney is wicked. Look at him, he's changed. And it's always a transition of doing something new. God works in a different way, and a lot of people can't get on board with that. Now, what happens today is we remember Whitfield, we don't remember his critics. Back then, they were alive and they ate his lunch. They chewed him up. The other thing about a revival is it's not just a spiritual thing. But you know, Whitfield is really the father of the American military. He's the guy who designed the first American military flag, came up with a military motto, military banner. Now, Whitfield died in 1770 up in Newburyport, Massachusetts. They buried him below the church there, down in the basement sarcophagus. The first Massachusetts regiment that went out to fight in the American Revolution, all stopped by that church, had a sermon about what was happening as soldiers going out into war. They all went downstairs, opened the sarcophagus, cut off a little piece of his robe to take with them because he was the inspirational father of the military.
So you know, we didn't think of a preacher, a Great Awakening preacher being the one that did that.
It's not just that. 1765, when we had the Stamp Act in America, now that's an economic thing.
Yeah.
America sent 2 people to Great Britain to argue against the Stamp Act. One was Ben Franklin, one was George Whitfield.
No kidding.
What's he doing in Parliament? What's he doing in politics? What's he doing with taxation issues? Because revival covers all aspects of life. It's not just spiritual stuff. It affects the way you live, the way you think, the way you act. That's characteristic. So
everybody's praying for revival, but now you're talking hard work.
Hard work.
You're talking it's going to take a long time.
A lot of opposition.
A lot of opposition.
It'll last decades. It's not fast. And the other thing that's really significant is it's always transgenerational. There's a revival recorded back in Judges 13 where God's people were under the oppression of the Philistines, and that they prayed and prayed, God, deliver us from the Philistines. We need a revival. God answered the revival. Verse 5 of chapter 13, God so answered the revival, He sent an angel to earth to tell people, I've heard your prayers, I've answered, you're going to have a revival. The way He did it was the angel went to Manoah and said, Manoah, God's heard the prayers of His people. He's going to deliver you. You're going to be free people. You're going to have a revival. Here's how it works. Your wife's going to get pregnant, and when that kid grows up, he's going to be the national deliverer. Time out. It's going to take 20 years for that kid to grow up. I thought you said you answered our prayers. God often answers the prayers for revival by sending a new generation that does it differently. Great example. Back here, Samuel Davies, he's considered the greatest pulpit preacher in the Great Awakening. he had a little kid running around with him when he was doing all this preaching. And as a matter of fact, Samuel Cooper, another great preacher in the Great Awakening, had a kid running around with him all the time. And Gilbert Tennant, another preacher in the Great, had a kid running around with him. And it's interesting. You know who the kid was running around with Samuel Davies? Little guy named Patrick Henry.
No kidding.
I wonder where he learned to be such a good speaker. He heard the greatest pulpit orator in American history preach and preach and preach.
And then he became the
and
greatest
then he became the greatest orator.
Oh, wow.
And you have a little kid running around with Sam. Oh, it's John Quincy Adams. That's who it is.
Wow.
And this guy named Elias Boudinot, the president of Congress who signed the peace treaty in the Revolution. Oh, you mean he was baptized by George Whitefield in the Great Awakening?
Wow.
And Benjamin Rush, considered one of the three most notable founding fathers, he ran around with this preacher named Gilbert Tennant and William Tennant. See, what happens is you have a new generation. Now, I think we're there now. And for example, in America, America's finally become 51% pro-life. It's taken us decades. We're now a majority pro-life nation. Isn't that really cool? When you look at the stats for our teenagers are 72% pro-life.
20 points more.
Only 19% of teenagers believe that abortion on demand should remain. Now, how did our teenagers get 20 points more pro-life than anybody that teaches them?
Has to be revival.
How'd they get more pro-life than the culture? How'd they get more pro-life than the teachers, their parents? Because God says, I've been hearing your prayers. Let me send you a new generation that'll do some things differently.
You know, in the examples you use, I mean, in Bible days or even the founding era, they seem to be a little more patient than we are. We're a real immediate gratification.
We're a microwave generation,
Yeah,
man.
we're a microwave
I mean, we watch the news all the time. We got a crisis going in some
Right.
nation, and in 30 minutes they'll get the experts on and tell us how to fix it.
Right.
You know, we've had these two nations fighting for 400 years, but we got a 30-minute program and told us how to fix the problem.
Yeah, so how much harder is it for us to
That's
say
right.
it's generational?
It's generational. And see, this is the question: as we pray for revival, how serious are we about revival? Are we willing to expend the work and the time and the effort and the discipleship and the mentorship of the next generation that it's going to take to do this? Because that's what a real revival looks like.
Okay, David, how about some questions from the audience about revival?
Sounds good.
What is it going to take to get revival in America?
Well, we're praying for it. We're asking for it. How do you get there?
Well, that's the starting place. You have to ask for it. You have not because you ask not, and you have to start by asking, which means prayer. I love what Founding Father John Hancock said about this. He said, I urge you, by all that's honorable, by all that's dear, by all that's holy, not only that you pray, but also that you act.
So it takes both.
Faith without works is dead. It's an interesting thing that if we start praying, and the Lord tells us a number of prayers to pray in the Scripture. You pray for laborers to go out in the harvest. If you get really dead serious about praying for God to send out workers in the harvest, your heart gets turned that direction. All of a sudden, I'll go do it. And so what happens is the more you pray for something, the more your heart gets into it, the more you're likely to start taking action on it. That's why I think it's significant that we're told in 1 Timothy to pray first of all. And by the way, there's nothing else in the Bible where we're told to pray first of all. But we are told to pray first of all leaders, those in authority.
So that's regardless of which leaders and who
That's
it
right.
is that's elected. You pray for the ones you agree with, the ones you don't.
But if you
pray for all.
if you pray for leaders and those in authority, before you pray for yourself or your church or your job or your kids, that's the only first of all in the Bible related to prayer. Pray for leaders and those in authority. If you start praying diligently for leaders, you're going to start saying, man, look what's happening in the country. We got to change this. Your heart will start taking you in that direction.
Yeah. How do you pray for your leaders if you don't even know who they are? I mean, I guess you can pray in general that the leaders of the country, but you almost have to start doing some homework and find out
Well, if you start praying for your leaders, you'll have a desire to know, who are my leaders? I don't know who my leaders are. And there are a number of prayer networks out there that now provide guides on. There's a great prayer calendar, for example, with Heritage Alliance.
Yeah, but in Texas,
That's
you get
right.
a daily, they'll give you
Well,
two
they have a
leaders to
national
pray for
calendar
every day.
too. You get to pray on this day for your senator, on this day for your state rep, on this day for your U.S. congressman, on this day for your governor, on this day for the secretary of the state, on this day for the
and it gives you a little
Supreme-
summary so you know something about them. Pray for their family.
That's
pray
right.
For,
And every day it gives you a leader and someone in authority to pray for. So Heritage Alliance is a good place, but there's a lot of prayer groups that do that.
Is it okay for me to pray, not only pray for that person, but pray that God send advisors to them if they're not leading from a biblical point of view, that He'll send advisors that'll influence them, that He'll change their heart. I mean, to actually pray for that leader and the policy they're implementing.
And you pray for the staff as well. Because even if you have a rotten scoundrel like Ahab, Ahab had a righteous guy named Obadiah working for him. And Obadiah, despite Ahab and Jezebel trying to kill all of God's prophets, Obadiah over here is able to get 100 prophets of God and save them, put them in a cave and take care of them. So you can even have really good people in a really wicked administration, and you want to pray not only for their counselors, because they need counselors, they need people giving righteous input.
That sounds like too, though, that when you're praying for that kind of, those kind of things with your leaders, you recognize that revival does come through the hands and the feet of the people. I mean, God does do it through these people in these positions.
You can pray for revival all you want, but if you're not willing to do something with your prayers, it's not going to happen.
Staying with this subject of revival, let's get another question from the audience.
How do we measure revival?
Well, I have to admit, I have no idea. How do you measure? I mean, we're praying for it, we want it to happen, but how do you know if you're in it or if it's happened and whether it's a good one?
Well, revival's a little different when you pray. I mean, if we pray for rain, we know when that prayer is answered, you know. If somebody's sick and you pray, God, heal them, you know when that prayer is answered. It's a little different with revival, but the Bible does give us a lot of indicators, and so does history. And one of the things that you'll find that happens with the revivals is you have changes in individuals, you have changes in culture as well. You look in the Second Great Awakening, part of the reason we knew it was a revival was because all of a sudden you could get hundreds, thousands to show up to pray. 10 years before, who wants to pray? It's a waste of time, or I'm too busy. But suddenly there's an interest in spiritual activities. There's an interest in doing something spiritual. Now, it doesn't stop there. I mean, you can't say we have a revival because we got so many baptized or so many joined the church. That's not it. Because it's not just what you say spiritually, it's how that works out through your life. If you have a real conversion experience with the Lord, your lifestyle is going to change. And if your lifestyle changes, what you will tolerate around you and what you demand to be around you will also change.
So it's not just your spirit, it's not just your heart.
Not just your heart.
It's how you act after that and what you're willing to put up with around you in the culture.
And that's a great way of saying what you're willing to put up with. Because if God's really hit you, man, you think lying is an abomination. And you're not going to let all these people that used to be your employees that are liars, so you say, guys, you got to cut that out. Yeah. Or you're going to say, no, wait a minute, I can't have liars in office either. These guys made all these promises. We got to get these guys out. We got to have somebody with character and integrity. Yeah. You start wanting and demanding different things around you. You'll demand more from the places where you go and what you patronize in the way of dining establishments. You know, there's certain things you won't tolerate. And you start working that up to the culture, and you can always measure revival by what it does to change the culture. The Wesleys had a revival in England back in the early 1700s, and it was measurable because suddenly nobody wanted to go to the bars anymore. They'd rather go to church than go to bars, or they'd rather be with their family than go to bars. I love what happened in New York in the Second Great Awakening. One of the founding fathers, James Kent, talks about it, and they were appalled that in the entire state of New York, over a 16-year period, they had 8 murders in New York.
16 years, only 8.
That's a murder
in New York.
In New York, Chicago's got a murder every 8 hours. See, you can measure statistical results. Say, wait a minute, God's changed people's heart. They're not wanting to kill each other anymore.
They act different.
They act different. So anytime you have a revival, it's not just spiritual measurements. It will affect the culture. If it doesn't affect the culture, it's not a revival. There have been revivals gone on all over America. People say, oh, come see this great revival at this church. It's not a revival unless it gets outside the church and affects the culture.
How about another question from the audience?
Would a national revival really make a difference in our government?
Well, we're back to this question. I mean, if it's a revival, spiritually there's a change, but then how does it work its way up to where we see that reflection in government?
Let's take this issue of policy for a minute, because as you look in the Bible, there are several revivals that occur in the Bible. You have a revival of the nation under Jehoshaphat. You have a revival of the nation under Josiah. You have a revival of the nation under Asa. Now, that's just 3 revivals, but let's take those. They'd been away from God, they came back to God. You take those 3 revivals, they're recorded in 2 parallel books. They're recorded in the Kings and they're recorded in the Chronicles. Now, there's a difference in these 2 books. The Kings, that's compiled by Jeremiah. The Chronicles are compiled by Ezra. Now, Jeremiah is a prophet. And in Bible times, a prophet was part of the king's staff. You remember, even Ahab said, hey, we can't go out to war unless we get a prophet in here. Let's get a prophet. And they bring a prophet and he said, I hate this prophet. He always tells me bad things. But they still got a prophet in. The prophet spoke directly into policy, directly into the king. So you got Jeremiah, he's got a very political view. And if you read the book of Jeremiah, you see that he's interfacing with the kings all the time. They throw him down in that miry pit. He sends word to the king, and the king says, I want to meet with you in private. Don't let anybody know we met. There's always this stuff where the prophets are working with the civil leaders.
And they had no hesitation in speaking out when
That's
something
right.
the civil leaders were wrong.
Spoke very clearly.
Yeah.
It's precedent of God's minister speaking in the civil arena. Now, on the other hand, you have Ezra, who is the scribe, the priest. He's the guy who was back at the temple doing all those hours of prayer and fasting. And it's interesting that when you read the same incident in the Kings that you have in the Chronicles, in the Kings you get a political viewpoint of it, in the Chronicles you get a spiritual viewpoint. Here's an example. In the Kings it'll say that the king so-and-so died and was buried with his fathers. In Chronicles it'll say, King so-and-so sinned against God, God struck him down and he died and was buried with his fathers. Well, you got a spiritual perspective over here you didn't get in the political.
Yeah.
So when you look at a revival, you can read the Chronicles and get the spiritual perspective. What's really cool is read the Kings and get the political perspective. Every time there was a revival, this is the striking stuff. Every time there was a revival in the Bible, you know what changed with every revival? Their attitude toward homosexuality.
Really? In the Old Testament?
They'd been tolerating it, they allowed it, and it said that when the revival came, that they chased the sodomites out of the temple.
So revival brought moral clarity and they acted upon it.
And it brought policy. Suddenly the church is not tolerating homosexuals in the temple. And with a revival, that's a political position,
wow.
But it's a result of a spiritual change. So as you go through and read revivals in the Bible, yes, there is a spiritual component to them. There's always a political component that goes with it as well.
So if we have a revival in America, then we should see changes not only in our attitudes, but in the policy on issues like abortion and marriage.
And that's why, historically, these are what were called common law offenses. Because this was common to nations, this was common throughout history, that this behavior is not acceptable. Yeah. And that's why in common law offenses, it listed everything from burglary, from arson, from murder to kidnapping, to theft, to rape, to homosexuality, to prostitution. And that's why it was always in the common law offenses. And that was incorporated in the Constitution through Amendment 7 of the Constitution. So, but I say that because common law goes back hundreds of years before the Constitution. They just took that body and put it into the Constitution.
Yeah.
And that's why it was part of the statutory laws for all the states.
All right, time for one more question on revival.
Sounds good.
America is so far gone, it seems we have only a few years left. How can we get revival in such a short time?
Well, you do hear this quite a bit. I mean, some people are out there saying, it's all over, grab your guns and canned food, go hide out at the ranch. I mean, they want to give up on America, and they don't believe a revival would work.
Well, what happens is those people are not very familiar with history because there is nothing new under the sun, but this also gets somewhat into eschatology. And as we get into eschatology, we see the end times. And I believe the Bible is the inspired, inerrant, infallible Word of God.
Yeah.
I also believe, because I believe that, Peter said he was living in the last days. Timothy said, Paul told Timothy, this is the last days. John said twice, I'm in the last days. What does that mean? That means the last days must last at least 2,000 years because we're still there. See, every single generation since Christ was here thought that Christ would return in their generation. Now, eschatology is divided in a lot of ways in the church. You have the pre-trib, the post-trib, the mid-trib, the a-trib, the pan-trib, the premillennial, post-millennial. You got all these positions. The simple way to look at this is exactly what Jesus told His disciples when they were thinking about this when's the Master coming back kind of stuff. Luke 19:13, He said, occupy till I come. If we think it's time to pick up and get out of here because it's just too hard, just too rough, we don't have Christian character yet.
Yeah.
That's when you dig in your heels and say, I'm going to be the last one standing. I love in the Old Testament as it talked about the three chief warriors for David. And you look at what those chief warriors did. You crawl down in a snowy pit with a lion, you know, on a snowy day. But the guy I really enjoy is the guy who went out there and defended a bean patch. And he stayed there and kept the enemy out of the bean patch so long they had to pry his fingers off it. Who cares about a bean patch? Give it up. No, no. I was told to stay here and defend this bean patch.
So this is my place on the wall.
And I'm not moving.
Yeah.
My commander put me here to do this bean patch, and you ain't getting me out of here. And so he stayed and defended that silly bean patch, or lentil field. He defended that bean patch till they had to pry his fingers. He was one of David's mighty men. See, and that's the kind of people God wants. Now, I will tell you historically, as you look back into the diary of Christopher Columbus says, I've talked to every major theologian across Europe. They all agree every prophecy necessary for Christ to return has been fulfilled. They all think Christ will be here in the next 70 years.
And that's in the 1400s.
That's in the 1400s. And that's why he wrote in his diary, he says, that's why I'm compelled. God has shown me out of Isaiah that there are isles of the sea that haven't heard the gospel. I've got to get the gospel there because there's only 70 years left. 500 years later.
A little bit, 500 years off there.
As you move into the founding era, founding fathers like Sam Adams said, we've talked to all the theologians, they all agree there's not a prophecy left to be fulfilled before Christ returns. They think he'll be here by 1800, and Sam Adams said, maybe, but I've still got stuff to do, but they were believing by 1800. We've had across every single generation, every prophecy has been fulfilled since a long time ago. Every single one. There's nothing left for him to return except the Father to say, okay, return. And that's all we're waiting on. Who knows how long that's going to be? That's not our business. It doesn't matter when he returns. We got to be occupied until he comes.
Yeah, because isn't it much easier to give up on the culture if you are saying, look, God's going to be back in 2 weeks or 2 years or whatever. Why should I worry about trying to turn the culture around?
And the other thing is it creates a pessimism. You know, it's all, this is the last days, there's nothing we can do to turn it around.
Yeah.
What makes you think so? I love Isaiah 59 where God says, you think my arm's too short to save? And even with Moses, he told Moses, get out of the way, Moses, I'm going to destroy this people. Now, when God says he's going to destroy people, he's going to do it. And Moses went and prayed, and God said, okay, I won't destroy them. How do you know what can be changed through prayer?
Yeah.
You think this is the last time? You think it's all written? God responds to prayer. He's changed so many times what he intended to do because somebody got involved in prayer. And we can't check out on this. I mean, we absolutely cannot check out on this. And you look in the Bible, how many times did Israel sink to the bottom of the barrel and God still brought them back? You know, still, I've got great hope for the country.
Well, I was going to ask you about America. I mean, we've had our downtimes.
We've had our downtimes.
We've had revivals and wake-ups and come back. So why couldn't it happen again?
And this is why believers need to know something about history, both the Bible and both American history, because this is not brand new water we're treading in. We've been here before. God's quite capable of handling this. He just needs some people willing to do some stuff. And that's what the key to revival is we've got to be willing to get involved.